So when did you both hear about red flag for the first time?
Over to you, Dave.
Over to me. Well, my first participation in red flag was in 1978, which was the second time the Buccaneers had gone to red flag. But I think it's probably important that people understand that red flag was spawned by the United States Air Force after the Vietnam War, analysis of the Vietnam War, and the linebacker series of operations proved that the Americans were losing compared to the enemy at a rate of 2 to 1. So for every MiG that was shot down, the Americans were losing 2 aircraft, which was clearly unacceptable. They worked out that most of the people who were lost, or aircraft that were lost, was within the first 10 sorties of a crew or a pilot's participation in the conflict. And so they came up with this idea that if you flew the first 10 missions in a benign, in other words, not live firing exercise, then you might survive better on at war, in war. And so they developed red flag, and first exercise were in 1975. RAF went for the first time in 1977, and I went in 1978. So that was my first experience of it. What about you, Mike?
Well, yeah, mine also was via the Buccaneer Force, in that I was a spotty-faced university cadet, and these two steely-eyed aces, Joe Hellier and Hoddy Hodson, came to talk to us all about it. Brought some gun camera film and flying around at unbelievably low level, etc. And yeah, really did sell it as well, exactly as Dave said. I mean, the closest that you could ever get to war, you know, without actually doing some. Some might say the most fun you could ever have with your clothes on, but basically that was very much what it was like. And having heard this, I thought, wow, that's fantastic. So when I arrived on my first squadron out in Germany, and we were going to go there at the end of the tour, I was desperately keen that yeah, that I should be able to do that. And yeah, so it was you know, very much an aim to get out there. Most guys expect probably to do maybe once every couple of tours. And it really was the highlight of a tour, is to go off and do that, because I mean, the flying was fantastic. The whole experience of going out to America, as a sort of fairly naive young chap who hadn't been there, was, again, amazing, exciting. Off to Vegas as well. So yeah, it just got better and better, really. It was sort of everything you wanted to do as a young lad.
Talking of Vegas, I mean, when Mike went on the Tornado Force, I went on the 2 tours on the Buccaneer, twice with the Buccaneer. Twice with the Tornado. But when we went the first time to Red Flag, we actually stayed on base in OQ's officers' quarters.
Oh no!
You say, oh no, but the social life around the mess was absolutely fantastic. Don't show this to the girls. But they had strippers in the bar on a Wednesday night, and strippers in the bar on a Friday night. And I mean, it was. You wouldn't get away with it now.
It wasn't very politically correct, was it?
It was not politically correct, but no, living on base was good. It was a bit of a hike into Las Vegas, but no, it was good. I mean, from the point of view of the flying at the time, I would say, was the best you could ever get in a career in the Royal Air Force. That's been superseded now by actual events in the Middle East, but then it was about the most operational flying. I think you probably agree with that.
I do, very much so, yeah.
At the time, it was the most operational flying you could get in the RAF.
So it might be different for both of you, but how did you get picked to go?
Well, if I may jump in first.
Yeah.
The squadrons were selected to go. You had to qualify in terms of experience. You had to have, Michael remember better than me perhaps. Yeah, as a pilot, you had to have a minimum number of hours on the aircraft. You had to be combat ready, etc., etc. Navigators, similarly, on a 2-seat aircraft, had to be spun up and of a particular level of competence. If you were a new boy in the squadron, you probably wouldn't get to go initially. In fact, I remember when I went on with the Tornado Force, some of the younger crews on the squadron came along in support roles, and it was the more experienced who got to fly, because you have to remember you're flying operationally down to a height of 100 feet or below, at speeds in the Buccaneer up to 580 knots, and in the Tornado on one occasion Tim Anderson and I got it up to over 600 knots, trying to get away from the fighters that were following us out of the area. But yeah, it's you weren't selected as such. You went with the squadron and flew if you were qualified to do so. My first experience, I was actually the navigator running the qualified weapons instructor course on the Buccaneer. So we took on the back end of a 208 squadron red flag exercise, we took the 3 QI student crews out to red flag for their operational phase towards the end of their course. So I went as the instructor on the course at the time.
Yeah, I was at the opposite end of the food chain to Dave, actually. I was on my first junior guy on my first tour, and I just about made the minimum requirements, and there were, I think, probably about 4 of us at the bottom end of the squadron, all competing for the probably 2 places that were available, or 3 places, so someone was going to be unlucky. And luckily my friend, who was actually a rather better pilot than I was his wife was due to give birth while we were away, so I went and he didn't. I sent him a postcard though, so...
Very nice, yeah. So, did you ever have any pre-exercise training?
Well, yeah, I think probably both of the Buccaneers. It was, the exercise was taken very seriously, so there was usually a really good workup beforehand. One of the first things that we all had to do was because normal training was 500 feet, 250 feet, low flying. Out in America, as Dave has mentioned, it's down to 100 feet, and that's actually, it's quite a big step. I mean, the first time I ever did it, I thought, good Lord, so big eyes, and yeah, and so it was an effort to, first of all, to learn how to fly at that height. And if you can imagine, if guys in the back, it's a massive leap of faith that this nutcase in the front isn't going to kill you. You hope that he's frightened enough that he's going to keep clear of the ground. But so the first thing was to actually work down to be comfortable flying at 100 feet, which once you did, you do get quite comfortable there. Yeah. But also then to build in tactics. And so, for example, one of the workups that I did when I was on 31 Squadron, we went to Lucas, and we were there for 2 weeks at RAF Lucas. We're working with the Phantom Squadrons there at the time, working through Spade Adam, on various ranges there, and also our Tame Army Major had got some inflatable tanks he took out and sort of put up here and there. There was actually, again, almost all the bits and pieces that were like a red flag exercise put up there in Scotland and Northern England, so we could actually practice it. But that was actually some of the best flying, because when you look at the actual flying, because the flag exercise were, you had one sortie a day if you were lucky and the weather was okay. On a 2-week detachment out to Lucas, you'd probably fly, twice a day, and so you really would fill your boots. So in many ways, the workup was, in some respects, better actually than the exercise itself.
I was just going to say that because on the workup training, as Mike said, you were down at 100 feet, you were down at up at 550 knots. Operating in low-flying areas in Scotland, they're cleared for that operating at that height, and you had fighters doing, intercepting you, combat, and the whole 9 yards. And particularly, I know in the Tornado, which I flew subsequently, we had self-defense weapons. When I first went out to Red Flag, the Buccaneer had no self-defense weapons whatsoever. So we had to. The aim of the Buccaneer was to always strike progress, is what we called it, and it was known as strike progression. You had to get through to the target no matter what, and you'd get airborne from Lossiemouth or Leuchars with a 6th ship of Buccaneers in information, penetrated towards the target, and then all hell would break loose as a couple of Phantoms would come into the middle of the formation. You'd split the formation completely. But you all knew what the time on target was, you all knew where the target was, and you all endeavoured to get back on the timeline. And again, 2 sorties in a day in that sort of environment was as good as red flag. But you had to do it to prove to yourself and prove not just to yourself, but to your peer group and to your squadron commander and the chain of command, that you were ready to go to red flag, because in red flag, because of the terrain and when we look at the maps later on, you maybe see it was a completely different environment, and there was a greater probability or possibility of somebody screwing up and hitting the ground.
That was on day one actually of red flag, when you went in for a mass briefing. They showed the horror film, and it was a whole series of airplanes spearing in, guys spreading themselves across the desert there. So
yeah.
It was actually, it wasn't a particularly benign environment. It's one where you could very easily kill yourself if you weren't pretty careful. So
the sun, the mountain ranges, and the weather factor out there, which was perfect, but it caused a lot of haze and gave you, I can't actually remember what they called that.
But it's like an optical illusion thing, wasn't it?
It was an optical illusion. A mountain would look. You'd look at a mountain in front of you and think you were about to clear the mountain, and suddenly you'd see that actually it was a bit further, bit behind. There was another mountain behind it.
And so also false ridges and things like that. Yeah, there was all sorts
false
of
ridges and all sorts of things. So it was really hazardous operations, but fantastic fun.
Yeah, that's right.
So how did it differ to flying in the UK?
In almost every single respect, I would think.
Yeah.
I mean, the terrain was completely different. The area, the actual ranges in there, it's about the same size as the whole of the south of the UK, so it's a massive area. But most of it's a plateau at about 6,000 feet above sea level, and it's completely, or would be completely and utterly flat, big salt pans with no foliage or trees or anything like that, dead and completely flat. And then, about every, I suppose, 20 odd miles or so, there'd be this range of hills that come plunge vertically upwards to another sort of 3,000 or 4,000 feet and then back down again. So you ended up with these vertical or massive, great big ridge lines, and high ridge lines as well, and then back down again and completely flat, and the series of ridges that you'd have to cross on the way in. So the terrain was completely different to the UK. It was there wasn't a lot to avoid. There were some farms in the middle of the area, and obviously Area 51 as well. So in terms of avoiding things, you didn't really have to. In the same way that in the UK you'd be avoiding sort of hospitals and villages and God knows what else. So that wasn't a problem. But no, it was a very, very different environment to operate in.
I think one of the things that was different too was the American air traffic control system. Whilst it was followed all the norms of air traffic business, the structure of the airspace in America was something that we weren't particularly familiar with. So they had very, very closely controlled corridors to get out of Nellis, into Nellis, and to the ranges. And although it was one massive range area, the Nellis range area, there were different things going on in different sections of it, and you weren't allowed to fly through them. So the first thing you did, this might sound odd in what was very much a low-level exercise, was you'd climb out of Nellis with your 6 or 8 aircraft to 15,000 feet, and you'd fly for a good 20 minutes.
Yeah.
At 15,000 feet through between two ranges, with this Area 51 dreamland off to your left-hand side, with everybody looking at it a bit like this, predominantly trying to see what they could see, and then up into the areas. For then you would have free play, to all intents and purposes. There were some restrictions, some imposed by constraints of your own operations, or some constraints that might just have been put on for that exercise by that mission commander on that day. So yeah, it was certainly different. I mean, the terrain, as Mike has just said, was completely different to anything we would have experienced. I didn't take part in anything in the Middle East. You did, I think.
Medium level, not at low level. So,
okay. Yeah. So even at that, the terrain, I mean, it didn't even match that.
So how many times a week or a day would you fly?
On red flag, it was very strict. It was once a day, and that assumed that you were that you were lucky enough for your airplane to work, and for, because I think we used to take, well, I say about 9 airplanes, but we usually launch 7 with the aim of getting 6. Although if the 7th was still around, then all would go. So you might find yourself on the program for, you know, during the week. So there'd be 5 flying days. In fact, there'd be 4 because the first one would be the mill day, but actual sorties probably 4. So you know, you might do 3 or 4, but again, it depends on the weather. If the weather was bad, because I mean, that part of the world, the weather's either fantastic or it's awful.
Awful.
And if it's awful, you don't fly.
Right.
Yeah.
That said, we because we had the terrain following radar, there were occasions when we were allowed to launch when most of the other aircraft weren't. So you could get a sortie in that, but again, it'd be fairly limited. But so the whole thing about flag was, I think, that you had this all the planning process, which Dave sort of touched on. We're going to go into in a bit more detail. You'd then fly the sortie itself, which was you know, sort of, I don't know, an hour's worth of utter carnage of trying to work out what's going on. But then you come back, and the kind of the main bit, I suppose, in many respects, was this huge debrief that you'd have, where you'd go through. The whole mission would be replayed. Every airplane carried a data link pod on it, so you could actually then watch the whole mission being replayed on this big screen and showing where all the airplanes went and all the engagements, and they'd stop engagements halfway through. Stop there, and you could flick to see the cockpit view from the fighter or whatever. They'd then put up threat video, so all the little SAM 8 sites and SAM 6 sites would have cameras on it, and they'd show their sort of their claims, so you could see how you got on with your countermeasures and things. And so the idea was, you know, again, coming back to what Dave mentioned first, it was to give you those 10 first missions, but to actually learn the lessons each time as well.
Yes.
So I mean, you only flew the once a day if you were lucky on all the days, but that it took out the whole day.
Yes, the whole day.
And then you go to the O Club and drink beer.
Drink beer, yeah.
And play tanks.
I mean, that's right. that's absolutely right. I mean, when I did the very first one, we didn't have data link in those days. There wasn't a process like that. It was all word of mouth. But that's neither here nor there. The principle was the same. But the QWI course, which we were involved in at the time, was always on the last wave in the day. But that didn't mean that you went in at midday, drank coffee, planned a route and flew, and then went back to the bar. You'd be in at 9 o'clock in the morning. If you were on the first wave of the day, you'd have been there until 5 o'clock in the evening, even though you'd flown in the first wave in the morning, planning, organising, talking to tomorrow's mission commander, you know, etc., etc. So it was a full day's work. And if you were on the end wave of the day, you probably got to the bar about 7 o'clock at night.
I'll ask about the Buccaneer first. How did it fare against the aggressors?
Well, as I said earlier on, first time I went, we didn't have any shoot-back capability. The second time I went in the Buccaneer in 16th Squadron, we had AIM 9 Sidewinders. But it's not. This aircraft was not built to get into a fight with anybody. It was built to go hell for leather, low level over the sea predominantly. The Buccaneer, when the first time I went, there were all sorts of myths and stories about about Buccaneers turning aggressors upside down in their wake at 30 feet over the desert. Frankly, I didn't believe any of them, and I'd had to seen it myself to be sure that it had taken place, which I doubt. But there was certainly an attitude amongst the American aggressor pilots, whether they be from the dedicated aggressor squadrons or Marine Corps F4 guys who are up for the exercise, that the Buccaneer had beaten the United States Air Force in the very first red flag in 1977. So in 1978, when we went, their attitude was if you can kill a Buccaneer, you're a hero in the camp. So it was get a Buccaneer or not. But the thing about the Buccaneer was we really could push it down to pretty low level. I won't say how low because I would only be contradicting a certain pilot. But anyway, you could push it down pretty low, and it would cruise at 580 knots, as steady as a rock. The fighters couldn't get a missile solution on us because of glints off the desert, which were taking away their infrared seeker head from the target that they were trying to get. So the only way they could get any kill on us at all was by coming down to our height. The Americans actually weren't cleared down to 100 feet, which made it a problem for them. That's not to say that they didn't come below down below 500 feet. I think they were limited. The first red flag I went on, I think they were limited to 500 feet.
Possibly so, yeah.
Yeah. But the other thing I think I'm right in saying, Mike, is that their guns were canted upwards, so they had to get below you to get a gun's kill on you, which was a problem if you hadn't practiced it. So I think the Buccaneer survived pretty well on red flag. I wouldn't say it got through unscathed, because I don't think any aircraft ever got through unscathed, but it survived pretty well. And of course the purpose of it was to prove our tactics to ourselves and prove if their tactics worked. So if we got shot down, change the tactics. What about Tornado? You can speak for the Tornado.
I will speak for the Tornado, yeah. Of course, the Tornado, by the time we went, the Buccaneers had already, it was a well-worn path, and the Jaguar guys had gone as well. So actually, you know, they had already validated that low-level tactic, which we adopted, and yeah, with pretty good success. I certainly against the ground emitters, we were very good indeed, and it was quite interesting. They'd show the videos, and the guys go, gee, a tornado, and then A, we were there and gone very, very quickly. B, we did what small amount of ground was there. We were very good at terrain screening behind, so we'd break lock that way, and also our jamming pod and our chaff dispenser were very, very efficient. So we were very good at that. Against the air-to-air threat, a similar thing to the Buccaneer. The Tornado did turn. It did carry 2 AIM-9 Lima missiles on it, so it could, in a limited way, look after itself. But it didn't. It was not the airplane to go taking names, kicking ass in, really, from that perspective. No. So again, our tactic was the same as the Buccaneer: run away bravely and split the whole formation so only one guy gets killed.
Yeah.
But again, making it difficult for people to get behind us, and the airplane did accelerate very well, and it did fly well. But one of the problems actually with flying low is that on a sunny day, you became quite visible because your shadows became very visible, because the guys would sit in their patrols up above and look down and see the shadow and go, there's a tornado down there, and go down. But and again, I think they did, because the RAF had done pretty well. I think that the guys were actually quite keen to get claims against us if they could, because the RAF did have a reputation of being pretty damn good actually, and hard to get hold of. So I think we accounted for that pretty well, really.
So did you always fly with the same crew? So do you always have the same navigator and you always have the same pilot?
Yeah, that was the thing that for flag, I mean, one of the jokes on I think all Tornado squadrons were on was that if you found something you particularly didn't like, you get crewed up them because you never fly with them. However, the one exception to that really was red flag, because it was taken so seriously, and so both the workup and the actual exercise itself, you fly as a constituted crew, which was fantastic actually, because you got to know each other really well, and you got to know how to work with each other, and you know the guy's strengths and weaknesses, you know yours, you kind of compensate for each other. So yeah, it was fantastic.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, generally speaking, in fact, if you go back to my first tour on the Buccaneer, I was crewed with one particular pilot. In fact, we'd gone through the OCU together, and I hardly ever flew with any other pilot for the whole of that tour. If I wanted to take leave, he had to take leave, so we flew together. But going back to the subject of red flag, not only did we fly as constituted crews, we flew as constituted 6 ships.
Yeah.
Because not only did you get to know as a constituted crew the foibles of the man in the front seat or the foibles of the man in the back seat, you got to know the foibles of the people around you. So you were constituted as a 6-ship or an 8-ship formation. You always flew with the same crews, so they knew what you were thinking and you knew what they were thinking when something happened. So it was well thought through, and it made us, I think, more effective.
Oh, it did actually. And it was like being in the winning team of on a rugby team or
Yes,
whatever.
exactly.
When everybody's working together and it's all going like clockwork.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic feeling. Yeah. And you come back from sort of it's gone really well because you've all kind of worked together. I mean, that's that's I wouldn't wish to say this in front of Navigator's journey, but they did. But I mean, that was one of the joys really of flying a two-seat airplane was it did take two of you, and it was a really when it clicked, it really did. And certainly the sum was greater than the parts, I think.
Yes, that's absolutely right.
So how did the Americans see the RAF or the British?
Well, I think they saw us as a pretty professional bunch of aviators. I think if you get a bunch of aviators together, no matter what colour of flying suit they wear or badges of rank they've got on their shoulder, they're all like-minded, professional in the air, and like a good laugh and a beer on the ground. So I think in that regard we were all the same. But they looked at us, they looked at this thing and thought, good God, who designed that? Because when it first went, they'd never seen anything like this before. But I think they were impressed with us. I think we did we put up a good show. I think they wanted to get a Brit rather than an American if they could, to paint on the side of their aircraft. I remember distinctly. I think it was my Buccaneer. Oh no, I think it was Tornado actually. I think this was when we got it up to 600 knots. Because I distinctly remember hearing we'd cleared the target and we were clearing the range, and I distinctly heard. Because let me just explain slightly. The bombers went into the area by one route, and the fighters went into the area by a different route, and we left by different routes as well. And we'll have a look at the map a bit later on. But we were egressing. That's the word we used. Ingress and egress. You weren't going in and going out. You ingressed and you egressed. Probably an Americanism. And we were egressing from the target when I distinctly remember hearing on the radio the AWACS telling two Air National Guard F-102s who had already exited the range to the south, and his words were, "Hey, whatever formation number, formation call sign they were, the Brits are still in the area." And these two F-102s turned on their heels to come back into the area to get the Brits. We were doing 600 knots to get away from them. They broke the sound barrier in an effort to get us, and we got back home safely. They got back home and were invited to the Brigadier General's office for breaking the sound barrier. So I think they looked in us in that regard as somebody, I wouldn't like to say a bit special, but a bit special.
Yeah.
Freedom fighters. But subsequently, in my time, there were F-16s, the aggressors. But having said that, there'd be F-15 Eagles there, against us. There would be Marine Corps F-4s against us. There'd be Hornets against us. You think of a fighter in the American infantry, and it was there on red flag at some point, trying to get at you.
Was one better than the other? The F-16, F-15?
The thing about the F-16 or the aggressors was that they actually operated to using Soviet tactics, and they were very, very disciplined in that. So they'd actually stand at the beginning, so right, today we're going to simulate, and they'd say, well, MiG-23 today, or whatever it's going to be, and they would actually fly the airplane as if it was one of those. So they'd be under very tight radar control, and they'd use the same tactics, and they limit the airplane performance really as well. So it was, just like the real thing. In terms of the other aircraft, I mean, all the ones that Dave's mentioned actually had really good radars, and particularly the F-15 would sit up high above and would aim to sort of zap you from
never know he was
10,
there.
20 or 1,000 feet. Yeah, and all you get is a little twinkle on the radar warning receiver that he's looking at you, and then try and work out how far away and where he was. But no, I mean they were very, very good. But I think we gave them a run for their money.
Yes.
So if we are the, let's say, will have been putting his package together, and he'd want the formation leaders there to do their bit. So we'll have spent yesterday on the ground looking at the basic plot of how we're all going to fit in, and when we've got his idea of the sequence of everything, we'll be given the targets, and so what we'll probably do is look at the targets, and then the two of us will, between us, decide the best way to attack that, and then I'll come back probably theoretically about sort of two minutes back to choose an initial point for the attack. And then what happens between the initial point and the actual target itself, largely I'll draw the map up for that. I'll look at some radar offsets, although I'm not an expert, and suggest to Dave, because he'll be busy doing other things. So that's my little bit, and then I'm going to be scrolling away looking at how we're going to get into and out of Nellis, and how we're going to get around here, and how the formation's going to work, and I'm going to start getting all the briefing stuff together. Dave, meanwhile, is going to do all the donkey work, which he'll now describe to you.
Well, the lead navigator's job is basically, having identified the target location and the attack direction from the pilot, his primary job is to get his team together of navigators to come up with a route. Now, the route lends itself very much to simplicity, because let's say the target's down here at Mount Helen Airfield. We're down at Nellis. We have to do the departure process, which is up through this corridor at 15,000 feet. And then there's a place here on the map which is colloquially known as Student Gap. It's called Student Gap because we're all students on the course, and there's actually a break in the ridge line here where a little bluff goes through, and it's known as Student Gap. So and you'd be given a flow pattern as well, and the flow pattern was, generally speaking, anti-clockwise. So from Student Gap here, we would plan, there's actually a route drawn on this map, so I'll use that. So from Student Gap, we'd go up country here, and you can see on the map, these light yellow areas are valleys, and these darker brown areas are mountain peaks. And as Mike said earlier on, the floor of the valley is about 5,000 to 6,000 feet above sea level, and the top of this peak here, this one here, for example, is 9,850. So you don't want to fly over the peak, but you don't also want to fly over too much flatland, because if you're flying over the flatland, the fighters can see you silhouetted on the ground and pick you up. They might not see you, but they'll see your shadow. And once you pass this line here, you're in enemy territory. So on the back of this ridge here and on the back of this ridge here are SAM sites and things called Smoky SAMs. Smoky SAM is a simulated surface-to-air missile site where they fire fireworks in the air, for want of a better expression. They're a little bit better than fireworks because they don't just go up to about 100 feet, they go up to about
a couple of hundred feet. But also, it looks just like a missile. It looks like a missile trail coming up at the ground.
So you want to avoid them, and they're hidden behind the ridges. So you try and stay as doing terrain masking as much as possible. So the navigators have to build in a split to get everybody to attack the target, generally speaking, from different directions, and then a rejoin beyond the target so that everybody's back together, because we gain mutual support from each other. In other words, the more we are, the merrier we are, the more we can see fighters, or the better information we have with regards to threats that are coming to us from surface-to-air missiles or anti-aircraft guns, ZSU-23-4 and things like that, as was in those days. So the navigator has to plan the route, sort out the split, sort out the rejoin, and then take another route back home out of the area to clear enemy territory. That's basically the navigator's job: sort out the route with his fellow navigators sort out the split and the rejoin off the target and the recovery back, and then back down the corridor to be back at base in some form of order. Didn't always work out like that.
The plan was there. But I mean, as Dave mentioned about timing, and that was really the thing that drove everything, in the mud-moving world, because you had a timing over the target, and once you declared that's what it's going to be, then you'd expect to be there plus or minus 5 seconds. So that means that everything goes back to a point where you have to be at Students' Gap at the correct time if you are to make that time. So absolutely everything you did was all driven by a timeline that you had to stick very religiously to. Absolutely. And again, that was the kind of the navigator's world, really, I think, wasn't it, in terms of making sure all the time everything worked out and telling you when to cut corners, speed up, slow down.
And making coffee for the pilots.
And making coffee, obviously, yes.
But the targets were all in this sort of area over here, and they would be airfields. And when I say an airfield, they weren't tarmacadam strips, but they were massive. There would be ploughed strips out of the desert, 10,000 feet long, parallel runways, parallel taxiways, parking bays off them, with actual aircraft on them. So they'd have taken old aircraft and dumped them on the end of runways and things to give you an aiming point. Surface-to-air missile sites, convoys. What else
industrial
was there?
site, wasn't there?
There was an industrial site, yes, an industrial site.
The airfields again were, the particular one at Talicha Peak was actually it was an exact replica of one of the a Soviet one in East Germany.
Yeah.
Was Erbst or Merseburg or something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
I think one of the other things is we mentioned these sorties would be an hour and 20 or whatever of 20 minutes there, 20 minutes back. So that leaves us with sort of 3/4 of an hour of mayhem between there and there. In the case of the Tornado, probably with a lot of reheat and fuel coming out the back. So again, it was really important to have a really clear idea about how much fuel you had in terms of how far could you go.
Yeah.
Sometimes how fast could you go? Because if you came back with extra fuel and you started, you saw fighters coming up, how much have we got enough to run away? What are we going to do? And so again, the guy in the back had the big picture, because in the front you were just trying to miss the hills as they went whistling past.
Yeah.
And so that was quite a critical thing. And I do remember, sorties with the guy saying, right, yes, you can use reheat now. You've got 500 kgs you can use. Once you get there, you've got to stop. And so there was always that balance of timing and fuel and everything else, and actually having the big picture all squared away.
So was every sortie different?
Yes, they were, because every scenario was a little bit different. Every package that was put together would be slightly different.
Yes.
However, that said, as Dave said, that is a big bit of airspace. From there to there is the same as, I think I said to you, it's about the same as Peterborough to Milford Haven. It looks big, but actually if you're travelling at 7 or 8 or 9 miles a minute, it's not very big at all. And if you've got 100 airplanes in there, all travelling at 7 to 8 to 9 miles a minute, it's pretty constrained. So there's, once you'd seen it once, you'd pretty much seen it all. So everything that came after, your first flag, subsequent ones were a bit of a rerun, really. You'd seen most of it before. That's not to say it was any less fun or exciting or anything else, but yeah, the scenarios were quite limited in how they played out to an extent.
Yeah, as I said, it was generally speaking an anti-clockwise flow, but of course, red flag lasted 2 weeks, and you would start relatively benignly. The first sortie was always a range recce, so you'd go up there on your own with other aircraft tootling around, and just familiarise yourself with the area, familiarise yourself with the geography, familiarise yourself with the prime navigational features, so that when your hair was on fire and you got a severe nosebleed, you could work out exactly where you were and not cause trouble to anybody else or yourselves. But then it moved up and up and up, and then the next day might be a 4-ship. Next day, there might be up to 6 ships. There might be limited aggressor activity initially, and then it would all ramp up, so that by the end, you'd be, as I was on that Buccaneer mission commanders, I was leading 36 aircraft through here. Some, and in my, that was 36 combat jets with fighters flying as support within the formation, bombers, but there'd be Hercules doing this, there'd be helicopters coming in from here to do drops up here, and the whole nine. So the whole, the whole scenario had built up over the 2-week period, so that by the time you were just about to pack your bags and head home, you had been in the ultimate combat mission over red flag.
Because as Dave said, I mean, the whole package was put together with, so you'd have a fighter sweep, you'd probably have a fighter escort as well, you'd have defence suppression, so there'd be the wild weasels going in, there'd also be jammers as well, so we'd end up with what they call the Spark Vox, the F111, the F111 jammers would be in there, A6E as well in jamming. As well as packages of aircraft, again mixed up, so those, for example, like the F-16, which could do a certain amount of air-to-air swing roll, would do that as well. So you try and sort of get everybody in a sequence where they could go in, take out the defences, the rest of the team would come in able to look after themselves, having taken out the fighter threat as well. So it was quite it's quite complex getting all that together and then sequencing it all through. And I say particularly, as they say, the first plan never, or a plan never survives first contact with the enemy. So you go in there with this wonderful plan, and it would just go boom like that.
And of course, all of this, whilst you're in this melee up in the ranges, it's all being monitored by back at Nellis Air Force Base on huge digital computer screens. And when I say huge, I mean wall-size computer screens, bigger than the walls of this room. And you might be, let's say you're number 4 in a formation and your call sign's London 4. Let's just use that as an example. You might hear in your earphones, London 4, you're dead. So you have to sort of stop playing the war for a period of a minute, I think it was.
I can remember that.
And or fighters might be taken out, so they would have to withdraw. So all this is going on all the time.
No time to relax then?
No.
Relax.
No, well, it was fast and furious.
Fast and furious. But back to the beginning, great fun. Great fun.
And actually, a great training tool as well, because that's how the Americans fought. So when the guys went off to the Gulf War, which both of us managed to delegate to other people to do for us, they fitted into the package in exactly the same way. And certainly, again, subsequent operations over Iraq were the same. You get your frag, which tell you what you're doing. You fit in, the same tactics were used. So because we were so used to doing this, we can actually fit in quite
easily into their ops.
So it was all a very, very familiar way of doing business. So it was a fantastic.
That's a very good point.
Training.
That's a very good point.
Well, that was the big thing, really, wasn't it? I think, Dave, in many ways. I mean, obviously, there's flying, but obviously the whole idea that you would learn from these 10, however many sorties you end up doing, and so everything we portrayed back on this huge, great screen, so you could watch the thing being replayed, and you could learn the lessons. And it was taken very, very seriously. And when we went through the whole sortie, reconstructed the whole thing in huge detail, really.
Yeah, I mean, you'd come back from the mission, hand the aircraft back to the ground engineers, and then go and have your own sortie debrief. So you'd debrief the sortie, you'd bring out the points that you wanted to as the leader, you'd listen to what the rest of the formation had to say. One thing about, certainly from the Buccaneer point of view, and I don't think it was very much different in the Tornado, was debriefs with informations were honest. So if you'd screwed up, you admitted you'd screwed up. Or if somebody else had screwed up, you'd tell them they'd screwed up. They would understand why you'd told them that, and no ill would be thought of it. But because we were professional aircrew and we needed to be sure that we protected each other, and that, I mean, we're playing with people's lives here, for to put it bluntly. So you had to be honest, and so when it came to the debrief in the mass debrief at the end of the day, we tended naturally to be honest there as well, and take the knocks or admit our faults, so that everybody learned from them, not just that we learned from them.
So overall, did you enjoy your time at Red Flag?
No.
No.
It was fantastic. It really was. Yeah.
When you bear in mind that we deployed to Las Vegas always a week before the exercise started. So we had a week in Las Vegas to acclimatise, because you can't go from the European theatre, all these 115 degrees west geographically, to fly at 100 feet and 580, 600 knots and expect to do it the very next day, because your body is not ready for that sort of activity. Your body clock still thinks you're in Western Europe. So we had a week in Las Vegas before we started flying, and then we had 2 weeks of flying. As soon as the flying finished, we, generally speaking, would come home and hand over the aircraft to another squadron. It was a great place to be. I think Mike's been 4 times. I've been 4 times. Las Vegas itself palled after about the first time. But when you're 26, 27, and you're in Las Vegas, and dare I say it, somebody else is paying, who can't have a good time?
No, it's the ultimate boys' activity holiday, really, wasn't it? Yeah.
Boys' activity holiday.
Go and fly in the day and go and have a fine time down the strip overnight.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was brilliant. It really was fantastic.
It was.